Chapter 26. Friday noon. The idea of accepting George's workshop for her own was a great idea in theory, but the execution. Her small car was a hatchback. She reversed it up to the large open garage and parked. Then opened the hatchback. She started with the first pegboard, carefully removed all the hammers and screwdrivers and all the hooks. The actual wallboard itself was nailed in, but with a hammer she popped it off the wall, and with the first piece down, she put the tools from this pegboard in the front seat on the footwell and put the wallboard itself in the back of the car. The pegboard pieces were about 4 feet across and fit in easily enough. Then she went on to the next one and the next one, and within half an hour she had one wall empty. She then opened up all the doors to her car, emptied all the tools from the back wall into her floorboards or on the seats. Mostly there were saws and handsaws, a wrench set, and some other things like pry bars. It was quite a collection of tools. Many, she didn't know what to call them. Doreen took everything off the remaining side wall and loaded that all up too. She stood in amazement, realizing all the garage walls were now clean and everything had fit in her tiny car. The pegboards were in the back of her car, and although the hatch may not close properly, she didn't have far to go. The passenger seat and the back seats were completely full too. She had filled the rear well with several circular saws, what looked like a jigsaw, a bunch of other tools, and several small toolboxes. She wished she could get the 3 workbenches, but that would take a trip with a truck. One bench was small and 2 large ones were in the back. Each had drawers. She cleaned off as much as she could of the actual workbenches and then rocked a couple of them to the side, wondering how hard they would be to move. If she could empty the drawers and lay them in her car, she would just need help to get the actual workbenches home. And, of course, she had absolutely no place to put any of this stuff. She groaned when thinking about it, and then pulled out her phone and called Mac. "I'm not sure when you're off duty, but any chance I could get you to come to Penny's place and help me load up these 3 workbenches?" "Already?" he asked in surprise. "Yes," she said. "There's some urgency. Penny hasn't had any viewings yet, but they're likely to start this weekend. I've got all the pegboards off and all the tools loaded, but there's 3 workbenches and a couple tool chests. And I definitely need a truck to move them." "I'm on my way out in a few minutes," he said. "If you're still there I can come by." "I'll stay here and wait, and thank you," she cried out happily. She walked back to the first drawer where she had seen the journal and pulled it out. As she did so, something from the back fell to the floor. She reached down to find a small black book that was clearly from a long time ago. Opening it, she gasped when she saw the dates. Just as she started to read it, she heard a vehicle, knowing it would be Penny. Doreen pocketed the book and collected the tools in the drawer, but then thought she could probably fit the drawer on top of the pegboards. She moved the drawer to her car and grabbed the other 2 from the same workbench. By the time Penny came out here, Doreen smiled and said, "2 more drawers to load up and then it's just the big stuff." Penny shook her head in astonishment. "I had no idea you would take all this stuff. Look at how big the garage is now." She just smiled in delight and said, "It's huge. That'll definitely help to sell the house." "I hope so," Doreen said, "because now I have to figure out where to put all this stuff at my place." Penny looked at Doreen's car and laughed. "Oh my goodness, that's so true," she said. "You've still got toolboxes and workbenches, but that's it, right?" Doreen nodded. "Mac has his truck, so he'll come and give me a hand." "That's quite a friendship you have there, isn't it?" "A friendly business relationship," Doreen corrected with a chuckle. "He's been very helpful to me." "Sure," Penny said with a knowing smile. "But I imagine you've been helpful to his career too." "I hope so," Doreen said. She motioned at the walls of the garage and said, "You probably don't have to fill in any of those holes, but you know. Maybe even a good brushing of the walls would clean it up a bit." "It's a garage," Penny said with a wave of her hand. "If anybody wants to clean it up, they can fix it themselves." That's probably a good attitude, Doreen said. Penny unloaded more groceries. I have company coming tonight. Max said he'd be here in a few minutes, Doreen rushed to say. So can you give me maybe another half an hour? That's good timing then. And with that, Penny disappeared inside. She stopped at the open door to the garage and grinned. Thank you, she said to Doreen. Doreen nodded and smiled. Actually, thank you. She turned around at the sound of another vehicle, and sure enough, there was Mac. He backed his truck up to the side of her car, hopped out, took a look at her car and raised an eyebrow. She shrugged. I didn't want to leave anything behind just in case, she said. I didn't think it was possible to get this cleaned out that fast. Because George had it all hanging up so neat and orderly, she said. It took nothing to remove the tools, and there weren't as many as I thought because he had them spread out. He nodded. So what have we got, 3 workbenches? She nodded at the 2 in the back and said, I haven't pulled the drawers out of those yet. I've got the drawers out of this one. She motioned to the back of her car. Then she added, the big tool chests are coming too. Mac picked up the workbench, hefted it, and said, okay, this one's not bad, and he walked it to his truck. He put it on the side and headed for the other 2. He lifted the next and frowned. This one is heavier. I have room for at least another drawer, she said, pointing to the hatch of her car. He pulled out a drawer and said, well, this is very heavy. He placed it in her hatchback and then grabbed the last drawer and put it there too. We'll put the other 2 drawers from the other bench inside my cab. She grabbed the drawers, noting what looked like files and all kinds of stuff inside that she had no clue what to do with, and carried that to the front of Mac's cab. Part of her worried she was becoming Nan and grabbing stuff she had absolutely no need for. Another part of her worried she was just being cheap or thought she could sell this stuff. But with the 3 workbenches now empty, she grabbed the end of one, and with Mac's help, they lifted it up into the back of his truck's bed. He turned it on its side, took the smaller one, and laid it on the side inside, nesting them. Then he grabbed the 3rd one and put it on top. She stared at that in delight. Wow, she said, I didn't think that was possible. Those weren't the problem. He wheeled the tool chest toward the box. This piece will be the problem. She looked at it and frowned. We could take out the drawers, maybe? He shook his head, and while she watched, he lifted off the top half of the toolbox and set it on the ground. I had no idea it came apart, she said in delight. Not really apart, he said, but this bottom piece will be very heavy. It should be wheeled up via a ramp. We can't do that. But Mac was a huge man. He reached around from the back and, moving carefully, lifted the entire tool chest up onto his tailgate. And then he wedged it in close enough up to the benches that nothing would go anywhere. He made it all look so effortless. Then he lifted the top piece too. With the smaller ones up and tucked into corners, he nodded. Knew it would fit. She looked at the garage and said, it's almost completely empty. That's unbelievable. There was a broom in the corner. She grabbed it and swept up the empty room, so Penny wouldn't have to do it. But there was no dustpan. With everything in a corner, she knocked on the inside door. Penny stepped out and looked at the empty room. Wow, she said. Doreen pointed at the dust pile and said, I swept it up, but I don't have a dustpan or a place to put the garbage. Penny nodded. No problem, she said. I'll clean that up. She turned and looked around the garage. This is big enough for 2 cars, maybe even 3. It's a big garage, Max said. It looks huge now. That should be a big selling point for you. He secured the tailgate, gave the top bench a shake and said, good thing we're not going far. Doreen walked over to her car, waved at Penny, hopped into the driver's seat and then slowly pulled out. With all the tools lying everywhere in her moving car, there was an incessant clinking and rattling of steel on steel. But she drove carefully to her place, and then parked off as far on the right side of her driveway as she could. She had absolutely no idea what she was supposed to do with the stuff Mac was bringing. He backed into her driveway and stopped a good 20 feet away from the garage doors. He hopped out and said, "Did you really think about this?" "I really didn't," she confessed. "Wouldn't be so bad, but the garage." He nodded and said, "Let's take a look at the garage." She went inside the house and opened the doors for the animals, who all raced out to say hi to Mac. He bent down to scrub Muggs's ear when Thaddeus jumped up onto his shoulder. Chuckling, he gave Thaddeus several moments of cuddles too. Goliath just sat there and stared up at him. Mac went down on one knee and reached to pet Goliath, but Thaddeus bit him on the ear. "Ow," he said. Doreen chuckled as she came back out of the house with the garage key in her hand. "That means Thaddeus doesn't think you've given him enough attention." "Well, it's not exactly making me eager to give him more," Mac snapped. With a smile, Doreen unlocked the garage door and opened it. Mac stared at the contents and groaned. "How will you put any of George's shop stuff in there?" he asked. She shrugged. "On a good note, I did contact Scott, and he is excited about the tall boy down below. At least he'll get to see it tomorrow," she said. Mac nodded. "That's great, but we have to get to that door first. The weather looks to be decent for the next day and a half, and if we could have Scott at least look at whatever is here, we could possibly get in a dump trip or hire somebody to take this stuff to the dump, or maybe even get one of those dumpsters." Although she winced at that. "That'll cost you a few $100s," he warned. She nodded and said, "I know. I do have the money if needed, but if I can get away without one, I'd like to." Mac walked forward into the garage and said, "Some of this is just junk." He carefully pulled out a table missing a leg, and the table looked like cheap pine with a big scratch on the top. He moved that outside off to the grassy spot alongside the driveway, and Doreen pulled out several chairs that looked like they went with it, but they were in bad shape too. She shook her head. "Nan did say a lot of junk was in here." "Let's get as much of the junk out and see what's left," he emphasized after a sigh. She helped him move out a dozen pieces, and they were now a good 10 feet in. "It's going better than I thought," he said, "but I don't understand what this is." Doreen looked over at the pallet and groaned. "Nan said she bought this lot sight unseen and then got really upset when it was just car parts." He sighed. "We should take a look at it to see if it's got any value. But let's get the rest of this busted-ass furniture out of here. And if anything is good or decent," she said, "I'm a little short on furniture inside now." He chuckled at that. "Serves you right for getting rid of it all," he said. "And I'd get rid of all this too if I could." They moved out several more pieces. A table crumpled as soon as they put it down on its legs. Mac looked at it and asked, "Did you get a sledgehammer from Penny's house?" Doreen nodded and pulled one out of the front footwell of her car. She dragged it back toward him. He just laughed, picked it up and tapped a couple of the table legs from the junk furniture pile, and it all just collapsed. Within minutes, he had a small pile of expensive kindling. "That'll make it a little easier to haul out of here." Then he went back into the garage and brought out several more pieces. She got into the rhythm of things hauling them out, and if they were busted already or scratched up, he just destroyed them, further adding it to the pile of junk. Very quickly they were down to having almost a cleaned-out garage. She stood in the middle of the room. "Just like that, I now know how Penny feels. This space is huge." He nodded. "Still a lot of stuff is on the walls." He pointed to a bunch of hanging tools and some stuff leaning against the back wall. He looked over at the pallet again and said, "The question is, what will we do with this?"